Imagine a country sitting on the fourth largest proven oil reserves in the world, and yet its currency has lost more than 90% of its value in less than a decade. Imagine a nation of 89 million people, more than half of them under 35, educated, connected, and increasingly furious. Now imagine that same country is simultaneously being targeted by the most powerful military alliance in the Middle East, isolated from the global financial system, and holding together a clerical government that has, for over 4 decades, survived every attempt to dislodge it. That country is Iran, and right now, the pressure building inside and outside its borders may be reaching a point of no return. This is not a story about a rogue state in a vacuum. This is a story about competing empires of interest, Washington's strategic calculations, Tel Aviv's existential calculus, Tehran's ideological stubbornness, and caught in the middle of all of it, a population that simply wants to live. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the Burkinabe leader who has made a habit of naming what others are careful not to say aloud, has framed this crisis in terms that demand serious engagement. His analysis points not just to a country under pressure, but to a deliberate strategy of destabilization, and the terrifying possibility that if it succeeds, the Middle East could descend into a chaos that would make Iraq look manageable. So let's break it all down. Let's understand what is actually happening to Iran, why the United States and Israel want its current government gone, and what the world stands to lose, or gain, depending on how this ends. To understand the pressure Iran is under today, you have to understand the structure of the Iranian state itself. The Islamic Republic, established after the 1979 revolution, is not a simple authoritarian government. It is a hybrid theocracy, a system where ultimate power rests with a supreme leader, currently Ali Khamenei, who answers to no elected body, oversees the military, the judiciary, state media, and the Revolutionary Guards, and whose authority is derived not from popular mandate, but from a religious doctrine known as Vilayat-e-Faqih, or the guardianship of a jurist. Beneath this theological crown sits an elected president, a parliament, and layers of institutions that create the appearance of democracy, without surrendering the fundamentals of clerical control. For over 4 decades, this system survived. It survived the Iran-Iraq War. It survived the reformist era of Mohammad Khatami. It survived the Green Movement of 2009. It survived multiple rounds of crippling economic sanctions. But what it is facing now is qualitatively different. The variables that once allowed the Islamic Republic to stabilize have shifted, and they have shifted simultaneously in the same direction. Start with the economy. Iran's economy is not struggling in the ordinary sense. It is fractured. The sanctions architecture that the United States has built around Iran, accelerated dramatically during the Trump administration's policy of maximum pressure and not fully reversed since, has effectively severed Iran from the international banking system. Iranian banks cannot process transactions through SWIFT, the global interbank messaging network that facilitates international payments. Iranian oil, which should be the country's greatest source of hard currency, must be sold through shadow networks at significant discounts to buyers willing to risk secondary sanctions. The result is an economy that technically continues to function but cannot access the scale of revenue its energy resources should generate. The Iranian rial has collapsed. At the peak of sanctions pressure, it lost roughly 80% of its value in a single year. Inflation has repeatedly broken into double and triple digits. The price of basic goods, cooking oil, chicken, bread, has surged beyond what ordinary Iranian families can absorb. The middle class, which expanded significantly in the decades after the revolution, has found itself in freefall. People who once considered themselves stable are now calculating whether they can afford medication, whether their savings mean anything, whether the future they were promised still exists. This is where the internal pressure originates, and this is where Traoré's analysis begins to connect. Because the people experiencing this economic collapse are not passive. Iran's youth population, that demographic bloc under 35 that makes up more than half the country, is among the most digitally connected in the developing world. Despite government filtering and state censorship of the internet, Iranians have demonstrated a remarkable capacity to access information, use VPNs, communicate across borders, and organize. They watch what their peers in other countries experience. They know what political freedom looks like, and they are increasingly willing to say, publicly, that they want it. The protest movements that have erupted in Iran over the past several years are not peripheral. They are structural. The Green Movement of 2009 was organized around disputed elections. The 2019 protests were triggered by a sudden fuel price hike and were met with one of the bloodiest crackdowns in the Islamic Republic's history. Human rights organizations estimated that security forces killed hundreds of protesters in a matter of days, in a suppression so swift and total that it was only fully documented months later. Then came 2022, the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman who died in the custody of the morality police after being detained for an alleged hijab violation, ignited something that looked, for a moment, like the beginning of the end. The slogan that emerged from those protests, "Woman, Life, Freedom," was not just a cry against a dress code. It was a generational rejection of the entire value system of the Islamic Republic. Young women removed their headscarves on the street and burned them. Young men marched alongside them. The movement spread to universities, to bazaars, to cities across Iran's ethnic and geographic diversity. Baluchi, Kurdish, Azeri, and Persian communities all represented. Security forces responded with live ammunition, mass arrests, and execution warrants issued to young protesters. The movement was suppressed, but it was not extinguished. And here is the crucial analytical point. Every round of suppression deepens the legitimacy crisis. Every economic shock widens the gap between what the government promises and what it can deliver. The Islamic Republic has long justified its political structure through a combination of religious authority, anti-imperialist nationalism, and social welfare provision. Sanctions have gutted the third pillar. Structural repression has eroded the second. And a younger generation, raised with smartphones and global awareness, is increasingly skeptical of the first. What remains to hold the system together is, increasingly, force alone. This is the internal dimension of the pressure cooker. Now, let's talk about the external. Washington's relationship with Tehran has been defined by hostility since the revolution and the hostage crisis of 1979. But the nature of that hostility has evolved. During the Cold War, the United States viewed Iran primarily through the lens of Soviet competition and oil access. After September 11th and the invasion of Iraq, Iran emerged as a major beneficiary of American policy failure. The destruction of Saddam Hussein's government removed Iran's primary regional counterweight and opened the door for Tehran to project influence westward into Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and beyond. The Obama administration's nuclear deal, the JCPOA of 2015, represented the most serious attempt at managed coexistence. The Trump administration's withdrawal from that deal in 2018, followed by maximum pressure sanctions, marked a return to confrontation. The Biden administration's attempts to revive negotiations largely failed. What all of this means is that by the mid-2020s, the United States and Iran are in a state of managed hostility with no clear diplomatic off-ramp. Washington's official position is not regime change. It has never formally endorsed the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. But the practical effect of the policy architecture, sustained sanctions, support for opposition media, pressure on regional proxies, cooperation with Israel on covert operations, functions as regime change by other means. The distinction between changing the regime's behavior and changing the regime itself has become increasingly theoretical. Traore's analysis highlights the nuclear dimension as a central driver of American and Israeli concern. Iran's nuclear program is not a new issue, but it has reached a qualitatively new stage. Since the collapse of the JCPOA, Iran has accelerated uranium enrichment significantly, enriching uranium to levels that are a relatively short technical distance from weapons-grade material. The International Atomic Energy Agency has documented Iran's progress. Western intelligence assessments have estimated with some consistency that Iran could, if it chose, produce enough fissile material for a nuclear device within a matter of weeks, though the conversion of that material into a functional weapon would take longer. For Israel, This trajectory is existential in the most literal sense. Israeli governments across the political spectrum have described a nuclear-armed Iran as an unacceptable threat to Israel's existence. Iran's supreme leader has repeatedly called for the elimination of the Israeli state, not always clearly as a military ambition, but with enough consistency and clarity to be taken seriously in Tel Aviv as policy intent rather than rhetoric. Iran's support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and various Shia militias across the region gives this hostility an operational dimension that extends the threat beyond nuclear theory. The October 2023 Hamas attack on Israel and the subsequent Israeli military campaign in Gaza transformed the regional calculus dramatically. Iran's support for Hamas, financial, political, and military over many years, placed Tehran in the frame of the conflict, even if it was not directly responsible for the October 7th attack. The exchange of strikes between Israel and Iran in April 2024 marked a genuinely historic moment. The first time the two countries engaged in direct military confrontation on each other's territory rather than through proxies. Israel struck Iran. Iran struck Israel. Both sides stepped back from full escalation, but the precedent was set. The taboo had been broken. This is where Traoré's framing becomes most analytically sharp. He is identifying that what is happening to Iran is not the product of one cause, but the convergence of multiple causes, all pushing in the same direction at the same time. Economic collapse weakens the state's legitimacy and its capacity to maintain social order. Popular unrest destabilizes the political foundations. Nuclear pressure from Israel and the United States removes the regime's deterrence options. Military confrontations expose the gap between Iran's regional ambitions and its actual defense capabilities. Sanctions prevent the economic recovery that might otherwise provide a stabilizing pressure valve. All of these vectors are simultaneous. All of them are intensifying. And the question that Traoré is effectively posing, without necessarily having all the answers, is whether the combination represents a coordinated strategy to bring the Islamic Republic down. Is this a deliberate plan or the convergence of independent pressures? That question may not have a clean answer, but the effect is the same either way. Now here is where the geopolitical analysis must become honest about its limits and about the lessons of recent history. Because regime change in the Middle East has a record, and that record is not good. In 2003, the United States removed Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. The strategic logic was compelling on paper. Saddam was a brutal authoritarian, a threat to his neighbors, allegedly developing weapons of mass destruction, and presiding over a country that could, in theory, be transformed into a stable democracy at the heart of the Arab world. What followed was 2 decades of sectarian conflict, insurgency, the emergence of the Islamic State, regional destabilization, and an outcome in which Iran, the very country the United States feared, dramatically increased its influence over Iraqi politics. In 2011, a combination of NATO air power and popular uprising removed Muammar Gaddafi from power in Libya. The strategic logic was humanitarian and strategic. Gaddafi was about to massacre civilians in Benghazi, and removing him would end a 40-year dictatorship. What followed was a fractured state, competing militias, an open arms market that flooded West Africa with weapons, and a civil war that has never fully ended. The vacuum created by Gaddafi's fall contributed directly to the destabilization of the Sahel, the very region where Ibrahim Traoré now governs. This is not a coincidence in Traoré's analysis. It is the core of his warning. When he speaks about Iran, he is not speaking as an abstract geopolitical observer. He is speaking as the leader of a country that has lived with the downstream consequences of Middle Eastern regime change, weapons, extremism, state fragility, foreign intervention disguised as liberation. The pattern he is identifying is not theoretical. He has seen it, he governs it, and he is saying, if Iran goes the same way, the consequences will not be contained. Iran is not Iraq. Iran is not Libya. Iran is a country of 89 million people, with a sophisticated military and intelligence apparatus, a network of armed proxies extending from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq, and a nuclear program at advanced stages. The removal of the clerical government, whether through internal collapse, external military action, or some combination, would not produce a stable, democratic Iran. It would produce a power vacuum of historic proportions in one of the most strategically vital corridors on Earth. Consider the geography. Iran sits between the Caspian Sea to the north, the Persian Gulf, and Strait of Hormuz to the south. Roughly 20% of global oil trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Any serious instability in Iran threatens that passage, and with it, global energy markets. To the west, Iran borders Iraq, with its Shia majority and its ongoing fragile reconstruction. To the east, Afghanistan and Pakistan, already among the world's most unstable states. To the north, access routes to Central Asia and the Caucasus. The Iranian state is not just a domestic political entity. It is a load-bearing wall in the architecture of regional stability. Remove that wall without a plan, and nothing above it holds. What does Washington actually want? The honest answer is that American policy on Iran has never been fully coherent, even within administrations. There is a faction in think tanks, in certain corners of the Defense Department, among some congressional voices, that genuinely believes the Islamic Republic is irreformable, and that only regime change will resolve the Iran challenge permanently. There is another faction that believes engagement and negotiation are the only durable path forward. The tension between these factions has produced a policy oscillation that Iran's leadership has, paradoxically, survived by treating both approaches with equal suspicion. Israel's position is more unified and more urgent. The Israeli security establishment has concluded, with a consistency that crosses political lines from right to left, that Iran's nuclear program represents an existential threat that cannot be managed indefinitely and must be either constrained through diplomacy or destroyed through military action. The military strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, including the spectacular series of explosions at Iranian nuclear facilities attributed to Israeli and American intelligence operations over the years, represent not just tactical operations but a strategic doctrine: degrade, delay, and destabilize. The difference between American and Israeli calculations lies in risk tolerance. Washington worries about regional escalation, oil market disruption, and the long-term consequences of another failed state. Tel Aviv is calculating that the risks of action, however severe, are outweighed by the risks of inaction. When a nuclear-armed Iran becomes the alternative, the calculus shifts. And this divergence in risk tolerance creates unpredictability, the most dangerous condition in geopolitics for the Iranian people. And this is perhaps the most morally complex dimension of this entire situation. The question of regime change produces a profound ambivalence. The millions of Iranians who marched in 2009, in 2019, and in 2022 were not marching because Washington told them to. They were marching because of genuine, deeply felt grievances against a government that has curtailed their freedoms, mismanaged their economy, and responded to dissent with violence. These are real people with real demands for dignity, democracy, and accountability. But the involvement of external powers in their struggle complicates everything. When the United States voices support for Iranian protesters, it does not simply add moral weight to their cause. It provides the Iranian government with a narrative weapon. The Islamic Republic has, since its founding, defined itself in opposition to American imperialism. Every protest, every labor strike, every student demonstration that can be framed as foreign-inspired allows the government to delegitimize it as a security threat rather than acknowledge it as a political demand. Washington's support for Iranian civil society is, in this sense, a double-edged intervention. Genuinely motivated in some quarters, genuinely useful to the regime's propaganda apparatus in others. And this is the trap. The Iranian people deserve freedom, but the path to that freedom that runs through American and Israeli strategic interests may not lead where Iranians themselves want to go. The history of foreign-backed regime change is not a history of liberation. It is a history of new dependencies, new vulnerabilities, and new violence. Traore understands this from a specific vantage point. His own country's political crisis, the coups, the insurgencies, the decades of French military presence framed as partnership. reflects the same structural logic. External actors with their own interests shape internal political processes in ways that serve those interests, not the interests of the people living with the consequences. The language of freedom and democracy becomes the packaging for strategic ambition. And the people who pay the price are not the planners in Washington or Tel Aviv. They are the ones left behind in the wreckage. So where does this leave us? What are the realistic trajectories from here? The first possibility is managed stalemate, a continuation of the current situation in which sanctions bite. Protests periodically erupt. Israel conducts covert operations against Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. And the Islamic Republic continues to survive through repression, adaptation, and the exploitation of divisions among its adversaries. This is the least dramatic scenario, but it is not a stable one. Stalemates that involve nuclear programs and popular uprisings do not remain stale indefinitely. The second possibility is negotiated de-escalation, a new nuclear agreement that provides Iran with enough sanctions relief to stabilize its economy while constraining its enrichment program and reducing its support for regional proxies. This is the diplomatic pathway, and it is the one that most foreign policy analysts who have grappled seriously with this problem advocate. But it requires political courage on multiple sides. Courage that the current configuration of domestic politics in both the United States and Iran makes extremely difficult to summon. The third possibility is what Traore is warning about: collapse. Not a clean transition, not a negotiated settlement, not a managed transformation, but the disintegration of the Iranian state under the combined weight of internal delegitimization and external pressure. This could take many forms: a popular uprising that the security forces refuse to suppress, a military coup that fractures the Revolutionary Guards, an economic crisis so severe that the government can no longer pay its own functionaries. The trigger is impossible to predict. The consequences are not. A collapsed Iranian state would not produce a democratic Iran. It would produce a broken Iran, fragmented along ethnic, religious, and political lines, with its enormous arsenal of weapons, its network of regional proxies, and its partially constructed nuclear infrastructure up for grabs. The Strait of Hormuz would become a crisis zone. The Persian Gulf states would mobilize. Turkey, Russia, and China would all maneuver for influence. The Shia populations of Iraq, Bahrain, and Yemen would face a new period of uncertainty. Israel might gain a tactical reprieve from an immediate nuclear threat while facing a far more chaotic regional environment. And the Iranian people, the 89 million human beings who have been living under pressure from all directions, would face the particular cruelty of having the change they wanted arrive in a form that produces not liberation, but catastrophe. The uncomfortable truth at the center of this analysis is that there is no clean outcome available. The Islamic Republic is not a government that will democratize from within. For decades of evidence make that clear. But the external pressure being applied to it is not a force for democracy. The historical record of similar interventions makes that equally clear. The Iranian people's demand for freedom is genuine and legitimate. The strategic interests of the United States and Israel in shaping Iran's future are real, and in some cases understandable. But the convergence of these forces does not produce a tidy solution. It produces a pressure cooker. And pressure cookers, when the heat is kept high and the valve is kept closed, do not gradually improve. They build toward an event. Ibrahim Traoré is not speaking as a defender of the Islamic Republic. He is speaking as someone who has watched the pattern repeat in Iraq, in Libya, in his own neighborhood, and who is naming the mechanism before the explosion happens rather than after. Whether the governments in Washington and Tel Aviv are pursuing regime change consciously and explicitly, or whether the cumulative effect of their policies amounts to the same thing, the trajectory is what it is. A government under simultaneous internal and external pressure, without a diplomatic off-ramp, with a nuclear program it cannot easily abandon, surrounded by a population that wants something different. This is not a stable configuration. What happens next in Iran will not just be an Iranian story. It will be a story about whether the international system has learned anything from the catastrophes of the early 21st century, whether the architects of foreign policy in Washington and Tel Aviv can hold two realities in mind at once: that the Islamic Republic is a government with serious problems, and that destroying it without a coherent plan for what comes after is not a solution. It is the beginning of the next crisis. The pressure is building. The clock is moving. And the question is not whether something breaks. The question is whether, when it does, anyone has thought seriously about what comes after. That is the challenge Traore is placing on the table. It is a challenge that deserves a serious answer.